Susan Southard was here last year. I had the pleasure of introducing her book, Nagasaki, and it's such a pleasure to welcome her back. Susan holds an MFA in creative writing from Antioch University, Los Angeles, and was nonfiction fellow at the Norman Mailer Center in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Nagasaki, Life After Nuclear War, is the recipient of the 2016 Dayton Literary Peace Prize and the Lucas Book Prize, sponsored by the Columbia School of Journalism and Harvard University's Nieman Foundation for Journalism, and was named a Best Book of the Year by The Washington Post, The Economist, the American Library Association, and Kirkus Reviews. Southard speaks across the United States about the humanitarian impact of nuclear war, and was invited last year to speak before the United Nations on behalf of ICON, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, the Geneva-based organization that recently won the Nobel Peace Prize. She has taught nonfiction seminars at Arizona State University, Piper's Writers Studio, and the University of Georgia, and directed creative writing programs for incarcerated youth and at a federal prison for women outside of Phoenix. Southard is the founder and artistic director of the Phoenix-based Essential Theater, now in its 28th season. Susan will be introducing David Wood, the 2017 Dayton Literary Peace Prize nonfiction winner for What Have We Done? Susan?
Everybody else is taller. Good evening, everyone. David, if you would give me just one moment before I step into the great honor of honoring you. I'm sure that many of you have heard about the terrible news in San Antonio of the shooting in a church. I don't know much about it yet because I've only heard from others tonight. But since we are here celebrating and honoring peace, I thought maybe it would be good for us, although it's not adequate at all, if we just take 5 seconds and collectively hold the people who have died and their families and the city and our nation in our thoughts. So now to what I had originally written. I just can't tell you how absolutely wonderful it is to be back in Dayton. This amazing, thoughtful literary community committed to the complex issues of human conflict and peace. And it is my extraordinary honor to introduce to you war journalist David Wood and his powerful and heartbreaking book, What Have We Done? The Moral Injury of Our Longest Wars. In this book, David illuminates a truth that until now has remained hidden, that beyond PTSD, which many soldiers suffer from, there is also moral injury, the psychological and spiritual wounds from committing, failing to prevent, or bearing witness to acts that violate a soldier's deeply held moral beliefs. Weaving history, ethics, personal stories, and commentary, and with deep respect for the strength, courage, and commitment of our military, What Have We Done reveals the excruciating moral predicaments that our soldiers experience in our current, seemingly endless wars. He tells the story, for example, of the intense moral crisis one soldier faced. In the middle of a firefight, he sees a child with a gun. Does that child intend to shoot, or is it a terrible coincidence of timing and the child is innocent? It's an impossible situation with no right answers. If the soldier doesn't shoot the child, his troops are at risk, and protecting his men is his first responsibility. But if he kills the child, he has killed a child. In a split second, he makes his choice, and an inevitable and profound moral injury follows and stays with him for many years. Other soldiers are haunted by the deaths of innocent civilians caught in crossfire or mistakenly targeted as the enemy. For many, the act of killing at all is a moral dilemma inherent in military service. Our soldiers are trained to serve with courage, respect, and integrity, and they are trained to kill, to transgress a fundamental human and religious ethic that later leads to haunting confusion about what's right and what's wrong. The moral injuries of war, these should be obvious to us, and the devastating effects on veterans, including undermining self-doubt, the inability to trust long-held values and ethics, unrelenting shame and guilt, and self-imposed isolation from friends and loved ones. We should know this already, but we don't. Our wars are fought in other parts of the world while we go about our daily lives, often barely acknowledging what has happened so far away, without understanding the consequences, not only to the people of the nations we are fighting, but to our own soldiers, day after day, both while they are deployed and after they return home. What have we done? And what can we do now that we know? There are no easy answers, no miracle cures. David offers ways past cultures have helped soldiers bridge the moral contradictions of military and civilian life, and he provides us with new ways to talk with and listen to our veterans. Most importantly, however, David provides an understanding of this critical missing piece of our perception of war and helps close the distance between us and those who are fighting in our name. His book allows us, at last, to rightly see our soldiers' moral injuries as our own. After all, this is our nation, our military. We are accountable for when and on what grounds we go to war, and we are responsible for the moral protection of our soldiers. So it is with immense appreciation and heartfelt congratulations. Please join me in welcoming to the stage this year's Dayton Literary Peace Prize winner in Nonfiction, David Wood.
Good evening, friends, and I say that with the deepest amount of appreciation for this gathering. Sharon, thank you for bringing us all together. I am absolutely thrilled to be here in this incredible gathering, right? I want to introduce you to Elizabeth Smedley, who, when she was about 4.5, her father died suddenly and without warning, and Elizabeth stopped speaking. Her world was shattered. And her mother, now a widow, with 3 girls under the age of 7, and no job, no income, no home, farmed Elizabeth out to live with relatives while she got things together. And so Elizabeth went to live with relatives. She didn't speak. She instead immersed herself in books, books of all kinds. I think poetry was her special love, and she lived through the stories that she found in the books that she got. Well, she did eventually regain her desire to speak, and she went on to graduate from Swarthmore College and then went to Columbia, where she got a degree in library science, and she became the children's librarian in a small town in New York where she met my father. Yes, she was my mother. And so when I was growing up, Mom would walk around the house with a children's book, saying the story to herself, memorizing the story, so that on Saturday morning, when it came time for children's story hour, she could sit in a chair, hold the book out so that the children seated on a carpet in front of her could see the pictures, and she would tell the story. And she would tell 4 or 5 storybooks that way every Saturday morning. So I grew up with the understanding that you could be a storyteller. That was a thing. You know, like every kid, I wanted to be a pilot or a race car driver or a mountain climber or something exciting like that. But I knew I could also be a storyteller. I never thought of it that way, but looking back on it, I see that I did grow up with that idea. And indeed, I did become a storyteller. I went on to become a journalist and, in short order, a war correspondent. So I did become a storyteller. My mother, Elizabeth Smedley Wood, was also the most gentle person I have ever known. I never heard her raise her voice, true. I never heard her use any strong language, anything that even approached strong language. I think she told me once that when she and her sister were small and growing up in a Quaker household, the worst thing they could say to each other was, "the Spitfire." So that was my mother, gentle, gentle woman. Towards the end of her life, she would take her motorized wheelchair out to Route 1 outside Philadelphia and hold up a sign beside the highway that said, "Stop the war." She was a gentle, gentle person. And it was with some puzzlement that she watched her son become a war correspondent. I did grow up as a Quaker. I was a conscientious objector and a pacifist. And she could never quite figure it out, although she was proud as any mother would be. I once spent a year embedded with the Marine Battalion. I basically lived with them for a year. We went to Somalia, and lots of interesting things happened. But the point is that I wrote a book when I got back because there was so much about Marine life, the life of these kids we send off to war, so many stories that told of their work, their emotions, their experiences, that I couldn't put in a family newspaper. So I wrote the book, and before it was published, I sent a copy to my mom, and I called her up after a few weeks, and I said, "Did you get the book?" And she said, "Oh, yes, Dave, I got it, yes, thank you." I said, "Well, how did you like it?" She said, "Oh, I loved it, but is he really going to use the word clusterfuck in my book?" And I was like, oh. You know, coming out of the words of a mouth of a Marine, that kind of thing is like 6 times a sentence. But to hear your Quaker mother say those words was shocking. And I said, "Oh, Mom, don't say that." She said, "What, clusterfuck?" I think she'd been waiting her whole life for permission to say something like that. But here's the interesting thing, and the point of all this is that towards the end of her life, she was failing physically, although not mentally, and she decided she was going to die. And I was headed off back to Afghanistan, where I would be for a couple of months, and so it was pretty clear she was going to die while I was in Afghanistan. And so I went to spend a day with her, as each of her kids did. And before I left, I asked my wife, Beth Frere-King, who's here tonight, I said, "I don't know what do you say to your mother? I'm going to spend a day, the last day ever with my mother. What do I say to her?" And Beth said, "Well, you could tell her that you learned to be a storyteller from her." I was like, that's right, I did. So I went and spent the day with her, and I told her how much I appreciated learning from her that you could be a storyteller. And we laughed and cried and hugged, and it was a wonderful time. And then I did go off to Afghanistan, and she did pass away while I was gone. The point I want to make here is that the telling of stories, being a storyteller, is so central to our culture and so central to the whole idea of building peace. And I've started to learn a lot recently about this hard, on-the-ground work of building peace. And a lot of it has to do with stories, listening to each other's stories, understanding each other through stories, telling each other stories. This is really critically important. So I just want to end tonight by recognizing all the great storytellers in this audience and all the rest of us who have stories and who can listen to stories. Let's go out and do it and build peace. Thank you so much.